Before we dive into this story, I want to make sure you're aware that this video contains mature themes and sensitive content. If you're uncomfortable with the topics of infidelity, relationships, and emotional conflict, you may want to skip this one. But if you're here for the truth, the heartache, and the emotional roller coaster of what can go wrong in love, then stick around. Also, if you like real, raw stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It means the world to me, and I promise you won't want to miss the next video. It was a normal Tuesday. Well, a normal day for me anyway. My husband, Richard, was in his usual routine. He left for work early as he always did. And I was left behind to manage the household, keep everything together. Just like I had been for the past 14 years. Don't get me wrong, I love Richard. He's a good man, and we've been through a lot together. But there's something that happens when you've been with someone for as long as we have. It's not that you stop loving them, but sometimes the love just feels different. It becomes routine, and as crazy as it sounds, I was missing the spark. The excitement, the butterflies. I thought I was just being dramatic, maybe a little tired. But that's when it all started, the thing I never saw coming. I was scrolling on Instagram one evening, mindlessly passing the time. I didn't expect to find anything special, just browsing as we do. Then, I saw it. A message from Dean, a masseur who had been following me for a while. I had seen his profile pop up every so often, but he never really stood out to me. This time, though, something in his message caught my eye. He was offering a special on his services. He was new in town, looking to build a client base, and thought I might be interested. At first, I was hesitant. I've had massages before, but I was never one to indulge too often. I glanced at his picture and saw his youth, his fresh face, that effortless smile. There was something about him that was different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I should have known better. I should have ignored it. But something in me told me to respond. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fatigue of the years with Richard. I don't know. But I made the decision. I told Dean I'd take him up on his offer. We arranged a time. I was both nervous and excited, unsure of what to expect. It wasn't just the massage I was interested in anymore. There was something else, something unspoken, that seemed to call out to me. When he arrived, I remember feeling a rush of adrenaline. Dean was even more handsome in person, and that youthful energy? It was magnetic. He made me feel seen, in a way that had been missing in my life. We talked for a little bit as he set up. I noticed how he had this calm confidence. He was self-assured, which I wasn't used to. Richard, as great as he was, had become predictable. Dean, on the other hand, was an enigma. Every word out of his mouth, every smile sent a little shiver through me. The massage began, and at first it was just that, a massage. His hands moved expertly over my shoulders, easing the tension that had been building up for days. But I couldn't ignore the spark between us. His touch was different. Each press of his fingers against my muscles felt intentional, almost intimate. And before I knew it, I was looking at him differently. As the massage continued, I found myself lost in his eyes. There was something in them that made me forget about Richard, about the life I had built. All I could focus on was Dean, his touch, his energy, the way he made me feel. I didn't expect it to happen, but it did. At the end of the massage, as I was starting to gather my things, he leaned in. The kiss caught me off guard at first. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even something I had imagined happening. But there it was, his lips gently pressed against mine. It was soft at first, a sweet gesture. But the moment our lips met, something inside me unlocked. I pulled back, my heart racing. I shouldn't have, I whispered, but Dean just smiled, that same confident, alluring smile. You deserve to feel good, Maria, he said softly. I should have stopped there. I should have pushed him away and never looked back. But I didn't. That was just the beginning. The next few weeks, I found myself thinking about him more and more. I couldn't shake the thought of that kiss, the way his hands had made me feel. My attraction to him wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, something that I hadn't felt in years. He made me feel alive again, and I couldn't ignore it. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was drawn to him. The more we talked, the more I began to look forward to his messages. Each text felt like a little spark of excitement. He was always there, checking in, making me feel like I mattered. By the time Richard and I had our next argument, I was already thinking about Dean in ways I shouldn't have been. Things had been tense with Richard. We'd been fighting more lately, and the little moments of affection had become non-existent. I told myself it was just stress, work, life, the usual excuses. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was looking for something I wasn't getting at home. And Dean? He gave it to me, effortlessly. I started seeing him more frequently. It was supposed to be harmless, just massages here and there, but the more we met, the more our connection deepened. And it wasn't just the massages anymore. Dean was no longer just the masseur. He became something else to me, a source of excitement, an escape from my mundane life. But I never imagined how far it would go. I still didn't know it at the time, but what I was doing was something I would regret. I was crossing a line that I didn't even know existed. The first time we kissed again, it was in the back of his truck. We had been talking for hours, laughing, just enjoying each other's company. And then it happened. Again, unexpectedly. He leaned in, and this time, I didn't pull away. I didn't stop him. And that was the beginning of the end. I wasn't just flirting anymore. This wasn't just about attention or feeling good. This was about wanting him in a way that I couldn't deny. And when I felt his hands on me again, something shifted. I couldn't help it. I was falling for him. I never expected it to happen like this. Never imagined that the simplest of moments would turn into something so consuming. But that's exactly what it was. I couldn't seem to break free from the pull of it all. Each time I saw Dean, each time we spoke, I fell deeper into something I couldn't control. Richard, he didn't notice at first. Our arguments continued, the tension growing, but he had no clue that there was someone else occupying my thoughts. Dean had quickly become my escape, my secret, and with every message, every glance, I felt the weight of the affair pressing harder on my chest. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. The truth? I hated myself for it. I hated myself for letting it go this far, for betraying Richard, but I also couldn't stop it. I wanted Dean. I craved the way he made me feel, and every time we met, the pull grew stronger. I wasn't just looking for affection anymore. I wanted him. I wanted to be touched by him. It started with the stolen moments, a kiss here, a touch there. But one evening, it escalated. Dean had invited me to his place for a private session, a new kind of massage he'd been offering. I told myself it was just another massage, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew this was going to be different. This time, I was walking into unknown territory. When I arrived, Dean greeted me at the door with that same easy smile. He had a bottle of wine ready and soft music playing in the background. There was a sense of intimacy in the air that I couldn't deny. My heart raced a little, but I tried to keep calm. I was here for a massage. That's all. But the moment he touched me, everything changed. His hands were warm and strong as they moved over my shoulders. His touch was firm but gentle, coaxing out the stress that had built up over the years. It was just a massage, but it didn't feel like it. The air between us was charged. My body responded in ways I wasn't ready for. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, I knew that the line we had crossed earlier had now become invisible. I turned to him and whispered, "Are you sure about this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that felt intentional. Almost predatory. His eyes locked with mine, and without a word, he kissed me again. This time, it wasn't soft or tentative. It was deep, hungry. His hands moved from my shoulders to my waist, pulling me closer. I should have stopped him. I should have pushed him away, left his apartment, and gone back to the life I knew. But I didn't. I let myself melt into him. I kissed him back. I wanted him to want me, and he did. That night, we didn't just kiss. He undressed me slowly, with purpose, his hands exploring my body in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was different. It was dangerous. And it felt exhilarating. For the first time in ages, I felt wanted in a way I had forgotten existed. Dean's touch was like fire, igniting every nerve in my body. I was lost in him. I had no control over what was happening, and honestly, I didn't care. I was drunk on desire, on the attention, on the way he made me feel. I hadn't felt this alive in so long. Not with Richard, not with anyone. He kissed me again, and this time, there was no stopping us. My mind raced, but my body was on autopilot, reacting to every shift, every touch. I could feel the heat of him, his body pressed against mine. We didn't speak much. There was no need. We were both driven by the same thing: the need for connection, for passion, for something more. I had never been with someone like Dean before. He was different, unpredictable, spontaneous. Every touch was a new thrill. Every kiss, a new adventure. It was like he knew exactly how to make me feel desired, wanted. And for once, I wasn't just someone's wife. I wasn't Maria the mother, Maria the dutiful partner. I was just Maria, caught in the moment, consumed by the pleasure of the here and now. When it finally happened, when he pulled me into him completely, I was overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. It wasn't like anything I had experienced before. It was raw, unfiltered, and unlike the careful, predictable moments I'd shared with Richard. With Dean, it was primal. It was something else entirely. We moved together, slowly at first, then faster, as if we were trying to make up for lost time. And I knew, deep down, that I was betraying everything I had worked for: my marriage, my family. But in that moment, all that mattered was the sensation, the feeling of his body against mine, the way he made me feel. I was so caught up in the pleasure that I almost forgot where I was, who I was with. But when it was over, when we finally stopped, I was left with a hollow feeling. It wasn't a feeling of guilt. Not yet. It was something else, a sense of longing. I wanted more. I looked at him afterward, still trying to catch my breath, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes. Not just desire, but something deeper. Something that made me feel like I was more than just a woman seeking pleasure. He made me feel important. But then, reality came crashing down. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be with him. And what would happen if Richard found out? The thought made my stomach churn. But Dean wasn't thinking about that. He looked at me and smiled. "You're beautiful, Maria. You deserve to feel this good." I smiled back, but it was bittersweet. I wasn't sure what I deserved anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after what had just happened. I left that night, my mind in a whirl. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't easily erase. But I didn't regret it. Not yet. I didn't know where this would lead. I didn't know how deep I was in. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I was hooked. And no matter how much I tried to resist, I knew I'd be back for more. The next few days after that night were a blur. My mind caught in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't make sense of. I was still reeling from the passion I'd shared with Dean. But that feeling, the one where everything was new, exciting, and completely out of my control, was slowly turning into something else. Something darker. Something that made me question everything I had thought I knew about myself. I had always prided myself on being a good wife, a good mother. I loved Richard, despite our flaws, but the truth was, I wasn't sure how much I loved him anymore. I had allowed myself to become numb, going through the motions. And when I met Dean, it was like a switch had been flipped. I felt alive again, like I could breathe. It was intoxicating. But at the same time, guilt gnawed at me. I knew what I was doing was wrong. There was no denying it. And yet, every time my phone buzzed with a message from Dean, a part of me couldn't resist. I didn't just crave the physical touch. I craved the connection. The way he made me feel special in ways Richard no longer did. And with each message, I found myself drawn to him more, unable to pull away. I wasn't sure how to navigate it. I didn't want to hurt Richard, didn't want to destroy the life we had built. But the more I saw Dean, the more I began to question whether I could ever go back to my marriage. Was I just looking for an escape? Or was this something more, something that was truly missing from my life? It was hard to admit, but part of me felt like I was falling for Dean. I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. But his presence in my life had become undeniable. His energy, his touch, it was a drug, and I was addicted. I remember the next time we met. It was a few days after that night, and Dean had invited me to a more secluded place. He had rented a small cabin out of town, a quiet place where we could be alone, away from prying eyes. He said it would be the perfect setting for us to reconnect. At first I hesitated. I knew what that invitation meant. I knew what it would lead to, but I was already too far gone. I needed to see him again. Needed to feel that spark, that connection. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Dimly lit, cozy, and intimate. Dean was already there, his presence commanding the room. He greeted me with that familiar smile, and for a moment, I felt like I was walking into a dream I didn't want to wake up from. We talked for a while, sipping on wine, laughing, and reminiscing about the first time we met. But there was an undeniable tension in the air. The chemistry between us was stronger than ever, and I could feel myself giving in to it. Dean didn't waste any time. He stood up, walked over to me, and gently cupped my face in his hands. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the desire there. Not just the physical kind, the kind that made my heart race and my stomach flip. "You're so beautiful, Maria," he said softly, his voice low and seductive. "You deserve to feel this good." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the heat between us rising like an uncontrollable fire. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't think straight. I couldn't stop myself. I reached for him, pulling him closer, pressing my lips to his. This kiss was different. It was deeper, more urgent. There was no hesitation now. We knew what we wanted, and nothing else mattered. His hands moved over me, pulling at my clothes, and I couldn't stop him. I didn't want to. I allowed myself to let go completely, shedding every ounce of restraint I had left. The touch of his hands on my skin made me feel like I was floating. Every kiss felt like a spark, and when his lips moved down to my neck, I couldn't help but sigh in pleasure. I had never felt so wanted in my life. We didn't say much. There was no need for words. We were lost in the moment, in each other. I could feel his breath on my skin, his hands exploring, claiming me in ways that I couldn't explain. Each touch sent waves of pleasure through my body. I had never experienced anything like this before. It was raw, passionate, and completely unrestrained. I wasn't just giving in to the moment anymore. I was craving it. Every part of me ached for him, for his touch, for the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. And then it happened again. We were together, fully and completely, in a way that I had never shared with Richard. The intensity of it took my breath away, and I couldn't stop myself. I was so caught up in the pleasure, the rush of desire, that I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything but Dean. When it was over, we lay together, our bodies intertwined, and I could feel the weight of what I had just done sinking in. It wasn't just physical anymore. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure I could go back. I looked at Dean, his face inches from mine, and saw something there that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just lust. It was something more, something deeper. I wasn't sure if it was love, but I knew that I couldn't just walk away from him now. Not after everything we'd shared, but even as I lay there, my body still humming with the after effects of what we had just done, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head. The voice that reminded me of Richard, the life I had with him, the family I had built. And yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Maybe, just maybe, I had been living a lie. Maybe the life I thought I had, the one with Richard, wasn't the one I truly wanted anymore. Maybe the love I had for him wasn't enough to keep me from seeking something else. And maybe Dean had given me something I couldn't give up. But the guilt was still there, lurking in the background. Every time I thought about Richard, I felt like I was betraying him in the worst way. I didn't know what to do, how to fix it, or even if it could be fixed. I was caught between two worlds, one where I was a wife and mother, and one where I was a woman discovering parts of herself that she had long buried. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that, but I also knew that this affair with Dean had changed me. It had awakened something inside me that I couldn't ignore. I was in too deep now, and I wasn't sure how to get out. Days blurred together in a haze of guilt, confusion, and longing. I couldn't focus on anything except the pull I felt towards Dean. His messages, his calls, his touch. It all haunted me. It wasn't just about the sex anymore. It wasn't even just about the thrill of doing something forbidden. I was falling for him, falling harder than I had ever fallen for anyone. But the reality of my situation was never far from my mind. Richard was still there. Still trying, still hoping, still believing in us. And I was standing on the edge, torn between the man who had been my partner for 14 years and the man who made me feel alive, made me feel desired in ways I hadn't known I was missing. I didn't want to hurt Richard. God, I didn't. But how could I deny what was happening? How could I pretend that this new connection with Dean wasn't something that had become essential to who I was? Each time we met, I felt more deeply entwined in his world. But when I looked at Richard, I could see the cracks starting to show. The subtle signs that he was sensing something wasn't right. I remember the first time I saw it. He had been so distant, so caught up in his own work that we barely spoke. But one evening, as we were eating dinner, he looked at me and asked, "Are you okay, Maria? You've seemed different lately. Distant." I froze. He could see it. He could feel it. The lie was no longer working. I quickly brushed it off, giving him some excuse about stress at work. But inside, a storm was brewing. I felt the weight of what I was doing bearing down on me. How could I go back to pretending? How could I sit across from Richard and pretend that I wasn't thinking about Dean, about what we had shared? Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my thoughts racing. I could hear Richard's soft breathing next to me, unaware of the chaos inside me. I reached for my phone, instinctively pulling up Dean's contact. His name lit up on the screen and my heart skipped a beat. "Are you awake?" The message from Dean was simple, but the timing felt like fate. I hesitated, feeling the weight of my marriage, of the vows I had taken, but then I typed back. "Yes, can't sleep." A moment later he replied, "I miss you." And just like that, my heart raced. I missed him too. More than I should have. More than I was willing to admit. We continued texting for a while, the conversation flowing easily, even though we both knew the weight of what we were doing. Dean, ever the smooth talker, continued to make me feel special, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. And that was something I hadn't felt in so long. But even as the conversation carried on, I felt a nagging voice in the back of my mind. The one that reminded me of Richard, of the life we had built. I was betraying him in every possible way. But even worse, I was betraying myself. And then, as if on cue, Dean sent me a message that changed everything. "I want to see you tomorrow. I need you, Maria. Just come to me. No distractions, no pretending." I read it over and over, my heart pounding. I knew what he meant. He didn't just want to see me, he wanted me, all of me. And for a moment, I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. I could go back to the life I knew, the life with Richard, the life that was safe and familiar. Or I could walk into the unknown, into a life with Dean, where the stakes were higher but the thrill was undeniable. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The choice lingered in the back of my mind all through the next day. When I woke up, I tried to focus on Richard. Tried to pretend that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the image of Dean, his smile, his hands, his body. I needed him, more than I wanted to admit. That evening, as Richard and I sat together on the couch watching TV, I felt a tension between us that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the distance. It wasn't just the silence. It was me. I was the problem. I was the one who had changed. I was the one who had let someone else into our life. I excused myself, saying I was going to bed early. Richard seemed surprised, but didn't push. He never did. I felt a pang of guilt as I kissed him on the cheek and walked away. I knew he could sense it. He could sense that something was off, but he didn't know the truth. Not yet. Once in my bedroom, I pulled out my phone again, my fingers trembling. I saw Dean's name staring back at me. I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I was too far gone. "I'm coming. I need you, Dean." And just like that, I made my decision. I drove to the cabin, the same one where we had been before. Each mile felt like a countdown, the anxiety in my chest growing with each passing second. But at the same time, I was exhilarated. I was finally doing what I had been craving. When I arrived, Dean was already there, waiting for me. The moment he opened the door and I saw him standing there, I felt a rush of emotions hit me all at once. Desire, guilt, longing. And then I let go. We didn't speak much when I entered. There was no need for words. I closed the door behind me and walked straight to him, pressing myself against him, feeling the heat of his body. His hands were on me instantly, pulling me closer, kissing me with an intensity that left me breathless. I had crossed the point of no return. The moment the door closed behind me, everything else seemed to fade into nothingness. There was no Richard, no marriage, no life outside that cabin. There was only Dean. Only him. The heat from his body pressed against mine as our lips met again, and everything I had been feeling, every ounce of guilt, confusion, and desire, melded into something I couldn't ignore anymore. His hands were everywhere. on my back, my hips, pulling me closer until I could feel his breath on my neck. I let him guide me as if I had no control over myself. I was lost in the sensations. His kisses were hungry, demanding, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Maria? Dean whispered my name, and it was like a jolt of electricity coursed through my veins. I want to make you feel good. Let me, please. The intensity of his words sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't just giving in to the physicality of it anymore. I was giving in to something else. Something that made me feel alive. The touch of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his lips against mine, it all felt like it was meant to be. I didn't want it to stop. I couldn't let it go. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I had known from the very beginning. But now I didn't care. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about Richard. It was just me and Dean. Just the two of us, lost in this world we had created. We stumbled toward the bed, my heart racing as Dean undid the buttons on my blouse. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but it wasn't a fear I recognized. It wasn't the kind of vulnerability that left me weak. It was the kind that made me feel wanted, desired, in a way that Richard hadn't made me feel in years. I had tried to suppress this feeling, tried to bury it under the surface, but Dean was slowly pulling it out of me, layer by layer. I could barely keep up with his touch as he undressed me, his hands moving like they knew exactly what they were doing. The anticipation, the way my body responded to him, it was almost overwhelming. I couldn't stop it. Every inch of me wanted more. And when his hands finally reached the last layer of clothing between us, I gasped, a mix of excitement and nervousness flooding my chest. But Dean didn't stop. He was patient, taking his time. His hands slowly traced every curve of my body, and as he lowered me onto the bed, I felt the heat between us intensify. His lips found my neck again, and I couldn't help but moan, the pleasure almost too much to bear. "Maria," he whispered again, his voice low and sensual. "You're so beautiful." I didn't know how to respond. The words didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the way his hands were moving, at the way his lips were sending sparks across my skin. Every touch felt electric. Every kiss sent a wave of heat through me. It felt like I was drowning in him, and I didn't want to swim to the surface. And then, as if we were the only two people in the world, our bodies came together in a way that left me breathless. It was nothing like I had ever experienced before. With Richard, it had always been routine, comfortable, safe, predictable. But with Dean, it was raw. It was real. Every touch, every kiss felt like it was tearing me apart and putting me back together at the same time. I didn't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I didn't care. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming pleasure, the connection I felt with him. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the way he made me feel. Wanted, desired, alive. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt like I mattered. I couldn't stop myself, couldn't stop wanting him. And when the moment came, when we finally fell over the edge together, consumed by the rush of desire, I realized something. This wasn't just about the sex. It wasn't about cheating or betrayal. It was about a need that I hadn't even known I had, a desire for something more than just what Richard could give me. And the scariest part, I didn't know how to let it go. I didn't know if I wanted to let it go. We lay together afterward, wrapped in each other's arms. The silence between us was thick with emotions that I didn't know how to untangle. I wasn't sure if it was love, but I knew that I had never felt more alive than I did in that moment. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't escape the guilt. The nagging voice in my head that kept whispering about Richard. But it was too late. I couldn't take it back now. I had already crossed the line. I had already let Dean into my life, into my body, and now it was hard to imagine life without him. He had become a part of me in a way that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. When I finally pulled away from Dean, I knew that I had to return to my reality. I had to go back home, back to Richard, and pretend like everything was fine. But I didn't know if I could do that anymore. How could I look at Richard the same way after everything that had happened? How could I pretend to be the wife he thought I was when I had become someone else entirely? I dressed quickly, trying to steady myself, trying to push the emotions down. Dean sat on the bed, watching me with those piercing eyes, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both knew what we had shared. It was undeniable. "Maria," he said as I reached for the door. "I need you to know something." I stopped and turned, my heart thudding in my chest. "What is it?" Dean's eyes were serious, his expression somber. "I'm not just doing this for fun. I don't want you to think I'm using you." I felt a pang in my chest. "I'm not using you either," I replied softly, even though a part of me knew I was. There was a long pause as we looked at each other. And then, without another word, I turned and left, stepping back into the life I had built, even as I knew that everything had changed. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. It was too late to go back. I thought I could keep the two lives separate. I thought that, after that night with Dean, I'd be able to go back to my old life, my marriage with Richard, and pretend like nothing had changed. But the reality of what had happened was like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the guilt. The next few days were a blur. Every time Richard spoke to me, I felt like I was betraying him even more. He was still trying. He was still believing in us, in me. But how could he, when I had already betrayed everything we had built? How could I look at him in the eyes and pretend that everything was fine? I tried to distract myself, to push the thoughts of Dean away, but they kept coming back. Every text, every message, every memory from that night lingered in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he touched me, the way he made me feel, the way I had given in to something I couldn't control. I felt like I was spiraling into something I didn't know how to get out of. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I pretended, I couldn't shake the truth. I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. I had hurt Richard in ways I couldn't undo. And even though a part of me wanted to go back to the way things were, I couldn't. I didn't know how to go back. I remember the day Richard came home and sat me down. His face was different, tired, concerned, as if he had seen through the mask I'd been wearing. "Maria," he said softly, his voice trembling with what I could tell was a mix of confusion and hurt. "I don't know what's going on with us anymore. But I need to know the truth. Are you still in this? Or is something else going on?" I froze. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the guilt almost choking me. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to confess, to rip off the layers of deceit and expose everything I had been hiding. But I couldn't. The shame, the fear, it was too much. So instead, I looked at him and I lied. "I'm here, Richard. I'm still here. I'm just stressed, that's all." He didn't seem convinced. But he nodded anyway, as if he wanted to believe me. I could see it in his eyes. The hope that I would come back to him. That I would stop being distant. Stop being someone I wasn't. But how could I be the woman he wanted me to be when I had already lost myself? That night, I went to bed beside him, but it felt like there was an ocean between us. Every inch of space between us felt like a lifetime. A reminder of what I had done and couldn't take back. Richard's steady breathing beside me did nothing to calm my racing thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dean's face. I heard his voice. I remembered the feel of his touch, the way he made me feel alive in ways that no one had before. I wanted to cry, wanted to scream, to do anything to make the ache inside me stop. But I couldn't. Because no matter how much I wanted to undo the choices I had made, I couldn't. It was too late. The next day I called Dean. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I was hoping for some kind of reassurance, something to make me feel like I wasn't crazy, like I wasn't losing my mind. But when I heard his voice, I realized something. I didn't want to keep hiding. I didn't want to keep living this lie. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't make myself stop. "I need to see you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dean's response was instant. "I've been waiting for you to say that." We made plans to meet, but as I hung up the phone, a sense of dread washed over me. What was I doing? What was I becoming? I wasn't sure what I was hoping for anymore. I didn't know if I wanted to keep seeing Dean, or if I was just looking for an escape from the guilt, from the suffocating weight of the life I had once known. But when I saw him that afternoon, when I felt his arms around me again, I realized something else. It wasn't about the sex, it wasn't about the passion. It was about the connection, the way he made me feel seen, heard, understood. something that I hadn't felt in years. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how much I loved Richard, no matter how much I had once promised to him, this was the person I needed. Dean wasn't just a distraction. He wasn't just a fling. He had become someone I couldn't ignore. And yet, I still didn't know what to do about it. I stood there, caught between two worlds, unsure of how to move forward. I loved Richard, but I didn't know if I could continue living a life that wasn't fulfilling me, a life where I felt suffocated and invisible. As I walked back to my car after meeting Dean that day, I realized something else. I had lost control. The life I had known, the life with Richard, the marriage we had built, it was slipping away. And I didn't know if I could save it. It was too late to go back. The only question now was, could I move forward? And if so, with who? As I stand here, torn between two worlds, I realize that there's no simple answer. No easy way to undo what's been done. I've hurt Richard, I've betrayed him, and now I'm caught between guilt, desire, and confusion. The choices I've made have put me on a path I can't turn back from, and now I have to live with the consequences. But in the end, the hardest part isn't just the affair or the lies. It's looking in the mirror and wondering who I am now. Am I still the woman I was? Or have I become someone else entirely? I don't have the answers, not yet. But I do know one thing. The journey I'm on has only just begun. If you've been following this story, if you felt every twist and turn with me, then you know there's still so much more to come. What happens next? How do I move forward? Don't miss what's to come. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. How would you handle a situation like mine? Thank you for being with me on this journey. I'll see you in the next one.